The sulfur from the match flared into a bright, orange-white spark, cutting through the heavy, humid darkness of Lincoln Avenue like a lightning bolt. It was a tiny flame, no larger than a teardrop, but it carried the weight of a death warrant. Across the sidewalk, John Dillinger saw it. He didn't just see a man lighting a cigar, he saw the signal he had been dreading for a decade. In that split second, the world slowed to a crawl. The sounds of the Chicago night, the distant clang of a streetcar, the low hum of the city's chatter, the frantic chirping of crickets in the heat, all vanished into a vacuum of silence. His heart, a muscle hardened by the steel cages of Pendleton and the machine gun fire of Little Bohemia, gave a singular, heavy thud against his ribs. He felt the betrayal before the bullets even left the barrels. He felt the cold touch of the pavement in his mind before his body ever hit the ground. The most hunted man in America was no longer the hunter, he was the prey, caught in a circle of steel, silk, and shadows. But to understand how this legend, a man who had outsmarted the entire federal government and made J. Edgar Hoover look like a fool, ended up in a pool of blood in a filthy Chicago alley, we have to look at the suffocating reality of July 22, 1934. The temperature in Chicago had peaked at a brutal 102 degrees earlier that afternoon. Even now, late at night, the city didn't just feel hot. It felt like it was breathing through a wet, heavy shroud. The asphalt radiated a bone-deep heat that made the horizon shimmer with mirages of lead and fire. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust, cheap perfume, and the exhausted anger of the Great Depression. John Dillinger, the man the FBI called Public Enemy No. 1, had just stepped out of the air-conditioned sanctuary of the Biograph Theater. He was walking between icky women who represented the two halves of his life, Polly Hamilton, the naive girlfriend who loved the man, and Anna Sage, that woman in red, who had already sold the legend for $10,000 and a residency permit. Dillinger reached into his pocket for a cigar. His movement smooth, practiced, and deceptively calm. He was trying to maintain the aura of Jimmy Lawrence, a quiet clerk who lived a simple, unremarkable life. To become this man, Dillinger had gone through a literal, physical hell that most men wouldn't survive. Just weeks prior, he had sat in a dimly lit, makeshift operating room in a safe house, while underworld doctors Wilhelm Loser and Harold Cassidy carved into his face. They didn't have high-tech surgical tools, they had rusted scalpels, jugs of bootleg whiskey for anesthesia, and a desperate need for the $5,000 Dillinger had paid them. They had scraped his cheekbones, narrowed his nose, and injected paraffin into his chin to change his profile. Most agonizingly, they had used caustic acid to burn the very skin off his fingertips, layer by layer, in a futile attempt to erase his fingerprints forever. The pain of those weeks had been a silent, screaming agony. Dillinger had spent days in bandages, smelling his own cauterized flesh, waiting for the swelling to go down so he could walk among the people as a ghost. He had literally tried to carve a new man out of his own skin, hoping to escape the shadow of the man the law wanted to bury. But as he stood under the flickering neon lights of the Biograph, that primal, dangerous aura remained. He had the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen too much and done even more. You can change a face. You can burn away the fingerprints, but you cannot hide the eyes of a wolf when the pack is closing in. Inside the theater, the atmosphere had been hauntingly poetic. For 2 hours, Dillinger had been immersed in the world of Manhattan melodrama. He sat in the darkness, the flicker of the black and white film playing across his scarred, reconstructed face. He watched Clark Gable play Blackie Gallagher, a high-stakes gangster who lived by a rigid, unbreakable code of honor. In the film's climax, Gallagher refuses a pardon, choosing the electric chair over a life of dishonor or hiding. He tells his friend, "If I can't live the way I want, then at least let me die the way I want." Dillinger had leaned over to Polly and whispered, "That's a man for you." He didn't realize he was watching his own eulogy. He had laughed at the jokes and shared a bag of popcorn, finding a rare, fleeting moment of peace in the cool darkness. For those 2 hours, he wasn't a fugitive, he wasn't a criminal, he was just a man at the movies. But as the end title card appeared on the screen, his own credits were already rolling in the shadows outside. The Biograph was surrounded by a wall of flesh and iron. More than 20 FBI agents and Chicago police officers were stationed in every doorway, tucked into the dark recesses of neighboring buildings, and sitting in parked cars with their engines cold. They were terrified. These men were haunted by the memory of the Little Bohemia raid, where Dillinger's gang had turned an FBI operation into a chaotic, bloody embarrassment. They knew that if Dillinger drew his gun, the street would turn into a morgue. Melvin Purvis, the man who J. Edgar Hoover had tasked with this kill to save the Bureau's reputation, was sweating through his linen suit. His collar was soaked through, and his vision was blurred by the humidity and the sheer, crushing pressure of the moment. If Dillinger escaped tonight, the FBI would be finished. Purvis's fingers were slick as he gripped the match. When Dillinger walked out of the lobby, the tension in the air was so thick it felt like it would snap at the slightest whisper as they moved south on Lincoln Avenue. The woman in red began to execute her final move. Anna Sage started to lag behind, creating a deliberate, widening gap between herself and the target. Her dress, a vibrant, burning orange-red, acted as a flare in the dim streetlights, a beacon of betrayal meant to guide the bullets to their mark. She was a woman drowning in her own desperation, facing deportation back to Romania for running a brothel, and she had chosen to throw Dillinger to the wolves to buy her own freedom. Dillinger sensed the shift. The casual chatter of the street suddenly vanished. The families walking their dogs, the couples laughing as they walked toward the ice cream parlor, they all seemed to melt away into the brickwork, leaving only the predators and the prey. The rhythmic, metallic sound of his own leather shoes hitting the hot concrete was the only thing left in the world. He was alone. Dillinger pivoted. He didn't run toward the safety of the crowds on the main street. His instincts, honed by a decade of prison and a year of high-speed chases, told him to head for the dark. He bolted toward a narrow, grease-stained alleyway just south of the theater. He reached for the .380 Colt tucked into his waistband, his fingers grazing the cold steel of the grip. It was a weapon he had used to terrorize banks and break out of escape-proof jails, but tonight, it felt like lead. He was fast, perhaps the fastest in the underworld, but he wasn't faster than a dozen men who had been waiting for this exact second for months. Their fingers already tightening on the triggers. "Freeze, Dillinger," a voice barked from the shadows, but the command was lost in the roar of gunfire. 3 shots tore through the humid night, echoing off the brick walls of the alley like thunderclaps. The first bullet struck a brick wall, sending a spray of red dust and stone chips into the air. But the other 2 were true. One bullet entered the back of Dillinger's neck, severed his spinal cord at the base of his brain, and exited just below his right eye. The impact was catastrophic, the sheer force of the lead slamming his face into the grease-stained, soot-covered pavement of the alley. His body gave one final, violent shudder. His legs kicking out once as if trying to run one last mile, and then, the most famous man in America went still. The silence that followed was more deafening than the gunfire. This public enemy number 1 lay in the dirt of a common alleyway, his life's blood beginning to pool on the concrete, mixing with the grime and the trash of the city he had tried to conquer. But the scene didn't end with a quiet arrest. What happened next was a macabre, horrifying display of the cult of celebrity that Dillinger had built. As the agent stood over his body, their guns still smoking, the crowd didn't run away in horror. They surged forward like a wave. Men and women alike pushed past the police lines, ignoring the shouts of the lawmen. They weren't looking for safety, they were looking for relics. In a scene that looked like something out of the Middle Ages, women knelt in the dirt, dipping their white silk handkerchiefs and the hems of their summer dresses into the thick, dark pool of blood forming around Dillinger's head. Men tore at his clothes, trying to get a piece of his shirt, his tie, or a lock of his hair. To the FBI, he was a monster. To the people of the Great Depression, he was a martyr who had fought the banks that had stolen their homes and the government that had forgotten them. In that alley, the line between criminal and folk hero was blurred by the blood on the asphalt. Melvin Purvis stepped into the alley, his face as pale as a ghost as he looked down at the man he had spent his entire career chasing. He knelt beside the outlaw, his own suit stained with the Chicago grime. Dillinger's blue eyes were still open, reflecting the distant neon glow of the Biograph sign, but the spark of life was gone. There was no final confession, no grand statement about the law or justice. Just the sound of the Chicago night, the heavy panting of the agents, and the distant, wailing sirens of the morgue wagon. Purvis had won, but as he looked at the crowd dipping their clothes in the blood, he realized he hadn't destroyed a villain, he had created a ghost that would haunt the American psyche forever. The story moved from the alley to the Cook County morgue, where the scene turned into a morbid, 24-hour circus. Thousands of people lined up in the sweltering heat, stretching for blocks, just to catch a 5-second glimpse of the body. They filed past the cooling slab, some weeping openly, some standing in a respectful, terrifying silence, all captivated by the sight of the man who had lived fast and died young. The doctors who performed the autopsy found that his brain was larger than average, and his heart was remarkably healthy for a man under such stress. Physically, he was a man in his prime. Mentally, he was a man who had been dead since the day that Indiana judge gave him 10 to 20 years for a $50 robbery in 1924. The public enemy was a construction of a broken system, a man who had been pushed into a corner until he started biting back, and then bitten until he was dead. The real punchline of the night, the final word on the life of John Dillinger, was delivered not by the newspapers or the FBI, but by the streets of Chicago themselves. Before the sun rose the next morning, someone had scribbled a poem in white chalk on the brick wall of the Biograph Theater, right near the spot where his blood had stained the ground. "Stranger, stop and wish me well, just a prayer for my soul in hell. I was a good fellow," most people said, betrayed by a woman all dressed in red, the FBI celebrated. J. Edgar Hoover used the kill to cement the power of the Bureau for the next 40 years, turning it into an untouchable machine that could monitor and control the private lives of every American. But the woman in red was deported back to Romania anyway, her deal with the FBI worth less than the match Purvis had used to signal her betrayal. Melvin Purvis, the man who caught Dillinger, eventually walked into his own dark fate, resigning from the Bureau and eventually dying of a gunshot wound from his own weapon, haunted to the end by the ghost of the man he killed. John Dillinger's final act wasn't just a shootout in a dark alley, it was a transformation. In that grease-stained Chicago gutter, a criminal died, and an immortal American myth was born. The system thought they had won by killing him, but they only succeeded in making him untouchable. They buried the man in concrete to prevent people from digging him up, but they could never bury the ghost of the Biograph Theater. He was the farm boy who trusted his father and the man who was betrayed by his friends. He was the mirror that showed America the ugliness of its own laws and the beauty of its own rebellion. What would you have done if you were in that crowd on Lincoln Avenue? Would you have reached for a handkerchief to catch a piece of history, or would you have walked away from the man the system created and then destroyed? John Dillinger's story doesn't end with a bullet. It ends with a question that echoes through every courtroom and every prison cell in the world: who was the real criminal? The man who held the gun, or the world that gave him no other choice? In the next and final episode, we will look at the aftermath, the strange fate of Dillinger's body, the rise of the FBI, and the conspiracy theories that suggest the man who died in the alley might not have been John Dillinger at all. Stay tuned, because the legend is far from over.